Okay, we're going to talk about the muscles of the abdominal wall, so I'm going to move the most superficial out of the way to begin. So moving from most superficial to deepest with the obliques, we'll start with the external oblique. So the first thing I want to say about all three of these is that imagine that they extended all the way around and they come a little further down. But for reasons of showing how they stack and what they do, we had to go like this. So external oblique originates on the external and inferior borders of the ribs and inserts on the linea alba by a broad aponeurosis. So it's like this big, broad sheath of flat tendon called aponeurosis. External oblique has two different types of ways to move. So again, remember it's on this side as well. So we can do a bilateral or unilateral movement. Bilaterally, it's going to work to flex the vertebral column as well as compress the abdominal wall. Unilaterally, so just one side, it's going to laterally flex the vertebral column in that direction. So if you flex your left external oblique, you're going to move the vertebral column towards the left. Moving a little deeper, we have the internal oblique. Again, remember it comes all the way around. The origin is on the lumbar fascia and the iliac crest, so down in here actually. And its insertion is, again, so that linea alba, that broad aponeurosis, but then also comes all the way down to the pubic crest, and it also inserts on the inferior ribs and the costal cartilage. So it's really holding a lot of things in here. Again, we have the unilateral and bilateral movements. Unilaterally, so when the entire piece of entire muscle is moving, both sides, we're going to have that flexion of the vertebral column and the compression of the abdominal wall. When it's working unilaterally, just one side, you're going to have lateral movement of the vertebral column on the opposite side to where the internal oblique is working. So left internal oblique contracts, the vertebral column is going to flex in the opposite direction. Finally, deepest, we have transverse abdominis. Again, same as the obliques. We're going to have a broad, large muscle that has a bilateral and a unilateral movement. Transverse abdominis originates down here on the iliac crest and in the lumbar fascia. So there's a nice big fascia back here. And it's going to insert, again, linea alba and the pubic crest down here. And again, it's going to be flexing the vertebral column, and when it's working unilaterally and when it's working bilaterally, so just one side, flexing vertebral column in the direction of that contraction. Last muscle of the abdominal wall is our most superficial. It's rectus abdominis, really large, flat, broad muscle. Rectus abdominis originates the xiphoid process here, and then on the inferior surfaces of the ribs. Rectus abdominis is the six-pack muscle that so many people seek to develop, but it's very hard to see unless you have pretty much no body fat. And it inserts on the superior surface of the pubic bone near the pubic symphysis down here. And again, like all the abdominal muscles, it's in charge of flexing the vertebral column, so that flexion motion, and a compression of the abdominal wall in general. The muscles of respiration, which are in the thoracic area of the body. We're going to start with the, oh my goodness, there was just a hummingbird. It was very exciting. Anyway, nature. So we'll start with the kind of the most important muscle for respiration, and you can't really see because it's tucked up in there, but this big muscle, the diaphragm. And the diaphragm, its origin is on the central tendon, and the insertion kind of is all the way around. So in the xiphoid process, the inferior internal surface of the ribs 7 through 12, and also the lumbar vertebrae. So it actually would come down a little bit larger if I had made it so you could, we had to be able to see all the obliques and everything. That's neither here nor there. The action of the diaphragm is what makes it really interesting. When it flattens, It expands the thoracic cavity and increases the pressure in the abdominopelvic cavity. So this allows us to kind of draw in air. Moving on to more muscles of respiration, we have our external, internal intercostals. We'll start with the internal intercostals. These depress the ribs during expiration. Their origins, so they have between each one of the ribs, their origins are the superior border of the inferior rib, and they insert on the inferior border of the superior rib. And they're kind of a little bit closer in towards the sternum. Then we have the external intercostals. So imagine that was on every single space here. And they're kind of the opposite. So they elevate the ribs during inspiration. And their origin is the inferior border of the superior rib, and their insertion is the superior border of the inferior rib. Finally, with the muscles of respiration, we have serratus, anterior. So it's serratus, named that way for its shape. You see this kind of serrated edge that comes on all the ribs. And serratus, the action is to elevate ribs during inspiration, depress ribs during expiration. It helps out with the intercostals. And so its origin is all the way back in here. It's the spinous processes of the vertebrae and the inferior borders of the ribs, so kind of attached all the way through in here. And its insertion are the lateral borders of the ribs and also the spinous processes of the vertebrae, depending on where you are in it.
Moving on to the deep muscles of the back. We'll start with the spinalis, which is most medial to the spine. It originates on the sacrum, and it inserts up on the cervical vertebrae here. It is responsible for holding us in correct position, so standing up nice and tall, and also extension of the spine, so extending the back, which would be technically be hyperextension. The longissimus is in the middle, also originates on the sacrum, and then inserts on our costals up here. It is responsible for, again, hyperextension of the back and also erector, so known as erector spinae, all three of these. And then we have our iliocostalis, which also originates on the sacrum here. And then you can see that it's a little bit serrated because it also attaches on the costals here and all the way up and underneath onto those first couple costals. And again, it hyperextends the spine.
Just extends.
And it just extends the spine and hold us in alignment. Then we move on to our bigger muscles, more superficial muscles. Here we have our latissimus dorsi. It attaches, or it originates starting at the sacrum, all the way up to our thoracic vertebrae here. Its insertion is on the lesser tubercle of the humerus, and this is known as the swimmer's muscle because it does do retraction and brings that arm all the way around. So full muscle. And then we have our trapezius. It originates on the occipital bone up here and all the way down the cervical spine to the thoracic spine here. And then our insertion point is on the clavicle, so the midshaft of the clavicle, and then also the acromion process right here. And the trapezius elevates our shoulders, so this guy elevates our shoulders and also retracts our shoulders. And that is a couple of the back muscles. So we're going to continue our back muscles. We're going to start with the rhomboid major. It originates on the inferior medial border of the scapula, and it inserts on the thoracic vertebrae, so the first couple of thoracic vertebrae here. It is responsible for retraction of the scapula, so pulling your shoulders backwards, and also adduction, and then elevation. So elevation of the scapula here. Our rhomboid minor is going to originate again on the medial border of the scapula here, and it's going to insert on the lateral cervical vertebrae here. It is responsible for stabilization of the shoulder and also retraction, so adduction of the shoulder. And last but not least, our levator scapula. Its origination is on the first cervical vertebrae here, inserting on, again, partially on the medial superior border of the scapula, and it is responsible for lateral rotation of the head, so turning our head to the right and to the left, and also elevation of the shoulders, elevation of the scapula.